Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on using ISO 9001 and ISO 14001 to manage risk and identify opportunities in your organisation. My name is Louise Hollings and I'm Marketing Manager at LRQA and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You may have joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane in the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation and we'll collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. For your information, we'll be running some live polls today. Please note that the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a percentage result. The webinar is being recorded and we will share a link to the on-demand version to everyone who has registered. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. James Thomas, Auditor Manager at LRQA. James manages a team of multidisciplinary management systems auditors in the Midlands region of the UK, ensuring that they deliver value to clients in line with the international accreditation requirements and business assurance principles. Before that, James was a senior management systems auditor working with clients across a range of environmental, health and safety and quality standards. James has an MSc in environmental impact assessment. And Roderick A. Monroe brings extensive depth and breadth of experience working domestically and internationally as a coach, facilitator, instructor, consultant, and mentor. ISO management systems, management standard systems auditor, and safety and health, environmental, and quality risk advisor. His primary focus is on the strategic deployment and execution of organisational SHEQ continual improvement methodologies, incorporating simplification and risk-based thinking aspects with an emphasis on the application of performance improvement. Rod was awarded the ASQ Philip Crosby Medal in 2017 for his work on the ASQ Certified Six Sigma Green Belt Handbook, which is now in the 3rd edition. He's a frequent presenter and has written numerous articles for trade publications and magazines. Among his many achievements, Rod is a fellow of the CQI, Certified Quality Professional, ASQ Fellow, and IRCA Management Systems Lead Auditor. I'll now hand over to James.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our seminar on managing risk and identifying opportunities with 9 and 14,001. I guess the key starting point we need to talk about is where risk comes from and how this faces all organisations. So all organisations face uncertainty, whether that's from internal factors or external factors such as changing political or economic landscapes. The impacts of technological innovation or customers' changing needs all have risks that face our business. How you address this uncertainty can then influence the success of your business going forwards. We've got an image on the screen here which comes from the World Economic Forum Global Report on Risk. This tries to identify the many different sources of risk that face organisations. It talks about economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, and technological risk. It tries to give them an element of magnitude based on their importance and impact on businesses and how they link together in a wide framework. As you can see, it's a pretty complex diagram, but and actually is probably already out of date because things change at such a rapid rate these days. This volatile landscape leaves organisations exposed to more varied and faster moving risks, and these will only become harder to manage as digital and operational networks increase in complexity. To compete effectively in today's marketplace, businesses must be able to pivot and transition quickly in response to the changes in these risk profiles to ensure success. Once you've identified these risks and these sources of where they're coming from, the right approach to managing and identifying the risks can future-proof our business and create a strong position from which to develop new partnerships and pioneer new technologies and move ahead of regulations. It can provide us with a level of assurance and innovation we need to work in hand to create a framework through which risk can be managed and new opportunities created and drive towards business success. Fortunately for us, risk-based thinking is at the heart of ISO 9001 and ISO 14001. These standards give organisations all over the world a non-prescriptive yet structured approach to the issues that are most likely to impact them and give them a strong framework for managing them going forwards. I think we're going to hand over to Louise now for a poll question just to see where we view the biggest risks within our organisation coming.
Thank you, James. So our first poll question today is, which of the following do you see as the biggest risk to your organisation in the next 2 years? And the options are changes to legislation and regulation, supply chain disruption, environmental factors and climate change, sustainability reputational risk, or cost of living crisis and recruitment pressure. So those options again are changes to legislation and regulation, supply chain disruption, environmental factors and climate change, sustainability reputational risk, and the cost of living crisis or recruitment pressure. So I'll just give you a few more seconds to get your votes in. Again, the responses will just be displayed as a percentage. So they're just coming in now. Here we go.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you everyone for giving your answers there. I think we've got two key areas of risk which are kind of way ahead of the others that identified in your results there. Supply chain disruption. I guess the world now is a very different animal to pre-COVID, with supply chain disruption kind of becoming one of the key elements that occurred during the pandemic, with all sorts of manufacturing organizations being put on the back foot as supply chain simply couldn't deliver anymore. Coupled with that, factors in the UK and Europe around Brexit and importing changes, and suddenly, things which we took for granted, being able to get components or items very quickly from our suppliers, suddenly has become a risk we have to really manage. So yeah, definitely. And then I think as well, on both sides of the Atlantic, the cost of living crisis and recruitment pressures are putting significant strain on businesses. Again, it's this new world we're seeing in post-COVID, post-Brexit, with people looking to be less mobile and looking for more improved roles. And yeah, then issues pushing up costs of living in terms of oil crises, etc. Really putting pressure on companies now. Risks that perhaps aren't necessarily foreseen on energy and operating costs, which really are putting that element. So okay, so some good answers there. Fantastic. Okay, so if we move on, then we talk about the core principles shared between 9001 and 14001. So back in 2015, ISO 9001 and ISO 14001 were updated and both aligned to meet a document called Annex SL. Annex SL is a document that prescribes how management system standards are written, giving them a common framework to facilitate their integration so they can be easily combined together, but to also ensure that those common principles are shared amongst the standards, so they're all driving in a common direction. If we talk about those core principles, they're understanding and determining the organizational context, so making sure we really understand what we want our management system to achieve and the environment in which it needs to achieve it in. Providing a connection between strategic planning and business processes. There's been a long history of management systems focusing on kind of the tactical day-to-day activities. How do we make this item better? How do we make these changes without actually thinking about where the strategic direction of the business is going? So hopefully now with Annex SL, we're seeing that common alignment. Leadership. Leadership is fundamental to the success of any management system. So Annex SL-based standards now set out common frameworks for how leadership need to drive improvement and implementation of their management systems to ensure that the intended aims are achieved. Process approach is key, and I think we're all kind of used to talking about processes now because it's something that's become embedded with us. But yeah, not just a step by step. This is what we do, but actually, how do we change our inputs to our intended outputs? What's the most effective way using that process-based approach? And as part of that today as well comes in risk-based thinking. As part of Annex SL, we need to demonstrate these risks and how we manage them. And then linking to that, that's all tied together then using the PDA cycle. So plan, do, check, act, that management system cycle that we're all so familiar with. And to achieve that, then shared structure and alignment of text is one of the key core principles. So as we move on to the next slide, we've spoken about risk-based thinking being a core principle of ISO 9001 and 14001, but what does that actually mean to us? What does risk-based thinking mean? So there are risks in all systems, processes and functions. Risk-based thinking ensures that these risks are identified, considered and controlled throughout the design and use of the quality and environmental management systems. By using risk-based thinking, the consideration of risk is integral to the effectiveness of that management system. It becomes a proactive activity rather than being reactive in preventing or reducing the undesired effects through early identification and action. That way, we can demonstrate that preventive action is built into the management system and is risk-based. To help us achieve this, there's shared definitions of risk within all of the Annex SL-based standards. So, and these are common, therefore, between ISO 9001 and ISO 14001. So within the Annex SL, then the risk is identified as the effect of uncertainty. An effect is further defined as a deviation from the expected result, and that can be either positive or negative. An uncertainty is defined as the state, even partial, related to the consequence and its likelihood. So how likely is that event likely to happen? Combined together, they give us a definition for risk. If we really want to take this further, then sitting outside of 9000 and 14001, there's a whole new management standard in place called ISO 31001, which gives us lots of risk management guidelines and a background framework for undertaking risk management within a business. So that gives us an idea of what risk-based thinking is. Now we're going to go over to Rod, who's going to give us some clear examples of how organizations identify and manage risk within their organizations.
So risk registrars are one of the most common ways of trying to look at your process to look at the negative or positive impacts of a risk. For those in the quality backgrounds, we commonly use something called an FMEA, failure modes and effects analysis. On the environmental safety side, we use the PESTLE and the SWOT techniques. These can be combined. And then the ISO, as we just mentioned, the 31000 series, there's a whole group of guidance documents. One of them, if you haven't seen this, is called the ISO 31010, 3110. And that one actually goes in and gives a number of examples. You see a reference in the upper right of the slide where they use a cause and effect diagram too. So there's any number of ways. Now, the interesting thing is neither the 9000 or the 14000 require to use any one of these techniques. However, in the clause 9.3 for manager review, you've got to have some type of documented information of how you're thinking and looking at and managing your risk process. So that becomes your challenge. You've got to pick something. Here's some examples. Again, go back to the 31010 for additional examples. Next slide, please. So there are all kinds of things that I've been seeing. I've conducted anywhere from 70 to 90 audits a year. In the past 10 years, I've done well over 750 some audits. And I've been seeing a lot of different applications across the board of how we're looking at these. So one of the things that I was really fascinated with was one manager. He's only been at the organization 2 or 3 years, but he's got a number of employees that have been there 25, 30, 35 plus years. So he's made it a point to go out every quarter and pick one of those old timers, and he asks them a question: where's the next safety accident going to occur? Every single person gives him an idea. Usually it's something that's actually happened years ago, and then he goes and works on it to try to make sure that they could never happen again. Now, this could be used for environmental, it could be used in quality, it could be used in any of these things. But it's a way for him to get out there and personally talk with his people, which he does his gimbal walks daily anyway, but he focuses specifically on something at least once a quarter. A lot of us have either an FMEA control plans, especially if you're automotive or aerospace or something like that from the quality side. The safety people may have your JHAs, JSA risk assessments. From the environmental side, your environmental aspects and impacts matrix. So one of the techniques that I do when I go out, even if the company hasn't integrated yet, I ask for all these documents as I'm going into the manufacturing spaces, and I'm comparing them for consistency to each other. And I've driven a few companies kind of crazy with that because they have been working in silos and haven't thought about how their whole system works together. CPR for internal auditors, you can actually Google that now. It's an acronym. So the C stands for conformance or compliance, P is process approach, and the R stands for risk, of course. And it's just simply for your internal auditors, whenever they do their audit from a risk standpoint, they should be asking anybody that they're interviewing, what could go wrong in this job? And record it, because then that should go back up to the management review teams as they review the internal audits. And then that's another way for you to, quote again, document that you're trying to identify the risks. In case of emergency drills, for environmental, you've got to have an emergency response plan. One safety one that I found very interesting, an EHS manager during a fire drill had coordinated with one of his staff people up on a second floor that as they were coming down the fire escape, he faked a heart attack at the bottom of the stairs. And he did a very nice job because nobody could figure out if he was playing or if it was real. And it caused a lot of stir because nobody was prepared for that. So now he did tell him that it was fake once they started bringing the AED out, but it caused a lot of challenge for people because they weren't prepared for something like that. There's all kinds of things that you can do in your emergency response activities to test out what could happen and what does happen. And a lot of times, especially for environmental issues, that's one of the areas that I don't see people drilling very much. They wait for an actual spill to happen. A truck pulls into their back dock and it's leaking something. Well, then they go through and actually do the response. So what is happening around your site? What is your state of cleanliness? Is it neat? Does the processes flow? It all comes back to some of this risk, and risk again can be both positive as well as negative. Next slide, please. So in the ISO 9001, the word risk comes out in several different places through the standard. What we're trying to do here with the next two slides is point out where the word risk actually is. Now, with that said, there's another piece to this puzzle, and I'll get into this more a little bit later. But as you're looking at this, there's also these words as appropriate and as suitable. And this goes all the way back to 1988 when this 9001 first started. And it was always, how do you quantify those discussions? And when the 9001 2015 came out, I was listening to a webinar of a gentleman who does quite a bit of teaching for lead auditors, and he's on one of the technical advisory groups for the 9001. And he made a statement. It was just a side statement. It wasn't even on the slide. Whenever the words appropriate and suitable occur, we intended that to be risk-based thinking. And that caught my attention because it's not just the word risk, it's also anytime in either of these standards, any of the management standards, where the words appropriate and suitable occur, you need to be considering the risks to the application. Next slide, please. So in the 14,001, we do the same kind of thing. They've identified right in the standard where the word risk comes up. But again, it's the suitable and appropriates that also come up. And a lot of those are in clauses 7 and 8, where the word risk doesn't actually appear. So it's something that as you're building your organization, you're trying to improve your integration, or you are yet to integrate your process, to look at how is the system running and where do risks play in. And getting your internal auditors to be asking that of everybody, including the top management. What could go wrong when? How is this playing out? Next slide, please. All right, so starting in the left, if I'm going to be an auditor and I'm going to be looking at a plant floor, and because of that appropriate and suitable, I better never ever hear another supervisor say, that's the way we've always done it. That's like putting a red flag in front of a bull for a senior lead auditor, because they're going to start asking an audit trail of questions of why are you doing it that way? As you're looking at what other areas could you be trying to pull information for your risk, high scrap areas, customer complaints, could be OSHA recordables, or in the case of the states here, the EPA notices of violations, NOVs. Are any of these items present anywhere? What's happening with your regulations? What's going on? You've got all kinds of equipment, scissor lifts versus aerial lifts. What are the risks involved with that? Here in the States, we have quite a few regulations around aerial lifts that you have to have fall protection, but not on scissor lifts. And there's a big debate in this country, here in the States, should someone going up in a scissors lift have fall protection? Most people say yes, but it's not an OSHA requirement here. Well, how does that impact your environmental or your safety programs? And how can the auditors start observing what's happening as they walk around? I've actually invited a lot of teams when I go in and do audits, that I ask and let them know that, if you want to take some of your internal auditors and let them observe what I'm doing, not that I'm considering that I'm the best auditor out there, long from it, I'm learning every day. But I'm trying to get across to a lot of these internal auditors how to keep their eyes open, how to keep their heads moving, not only for themselves to stay safe, but to look at various observations within the organization. What is happening? And so this can happen in all kinds of ways. In one remote audit, I was noticing that there was a set of gloves sitting on top of a flammable cabinet. Well, that was fine. I identified, I pointed it out to them. They got the gloves off. The next year, I was actually on site, and I didn't even realize it at first, but I saw the flammable cabinet, but now I'm seeing the whole picture. And they had a electrical 440 box just up to the side of it. And I went nuts when I saw it, and I pointed out to him, I said, what part of explosion don't you guys get? And the supervisor caught it immediately, got the mains people, and they moved the flammable cabinet to another part of the building. But trying to be observant of your environmental the whole area as you're walking through it, be it an office, be it a production plant. What is happening? Can we look at and get past the forest for the trees syndrome? So how do you teach your internal auditors to be more observant of what's going on? Next slide, please.
Okay, so thank you, Rod, for giving us these kind of elements around risk and how it needs to be considered. As organisations, we also need to be aware that risks can be positive as well as negative. When it comes to management systems, we usually tend to have quite a negative approach, don't we? We always kind of think of the consequences and what's the worst that could happen and what we need to do to address those. But actually, we should also be thinking about the upside of risk and what are opportunities we can bring through the development of the management systems and what benefits that has on the business. So to help us do that, the standards asked us to talk about opportunities as well as risks. And to be effective and achieve certification, the organisation must demonstrate that they've determined, considered, and where necessary, taken action to address risks and opportunities that may impact their management system's ability to deliver its intended results, or that could impact on customer satisfaction or environmental performance if it comes to 14,001. So it's important that we use kind of risk-based thinking to identify these opportunities. We can use simple tools like safety triangles. They can be applied to quality concerns or to environmental incidents, and used to kind of forecast the types of incidents we may encounter, or when these issues may occur. Using that, we can then use that to identify preventive action and use these as opportunities to drive a positive result from our management system. Once you've identified these potential opportunities for improvement and how we can integrate them into our management system, then we need to apply risk-based thinking to ensure that we get the most benefit from these opportunities, making sure they're fully exploited, and that we're focusing our efforts and resources in the right places to get the maximum we can from those. Okay, next slide, please.
Ours are supposed to be within a certain distance from the shafts. And if that shaft is sticking out too far, it's got to have a guard over it. And at one point, I was looking at this shaft sticking out almost 3 inches. It was key notched, and it was literally right at my shoulder level. And I'm looking at it, and I said to the HS manager, I said, we got a problem here. Somebody could get caught on this. And he looked at me and said, oh, nobody could get caught on that. The operator was right behind us. He looked at me and said, Fred got caught on that 9 years ago. So, just because you don't think it can go wrong, check with the people working in the area. You might find out differently. Safety data sheets or MSDSs. I find so often people have no clue how to read those things, and there's both safety and environmental impacts in there. What's going on with those? Again, you don't have to have a formal risk registry, but what are you doing? How are you recording that? Because at the management review process, you got to have something. And me as an auditor, I'm going to ask, what do you got? And I'm going to start looking through it. And if it doesn't make sense to me, I'm going to raise some questions. It's going to become an audit trail. New employees, when they come in, how are they going to learn your system? In one case, Cal OSHA has a process out there where they don't require shift startup inspections of hoists and forklifts. And I'm thinking, okay, we got a problem here, or at least the hoist part. And so I was getting after, I've got one company, they got over 16 plants in the States and Mexico, and the California people didn't want to do their inspection on their lifts. And I'm looking at this, I'm saying, we got to do something. But at one point I asked a guy, and it turned out he was a new employee, he'd only been there a couple of weeks, and he went through the whole process of how to inspect it. And I had him show me, and it was perfect. And I looked at the EHS manager and said, how come this guy knows how to do it, but your people don't? Turned out, I asked him, where did you learn this? His last employer made him do that. Excellent. So they are pushing that now, and they're starting to make that because their director of environmental safety and health has now mandated across the board for all sites. So another fun one I have is service life of hard hats. It turns out, I always thought that it was a 5-year requirement based on the stamp that's in the hard hat, and that's not the OSHA requirement, at least here in the States. It's based on something called service life. And how does that impact your organization? So a lot of times when I go into plants now, I see hard hats with a lot of stickers on them. It tells me that hard hat's been around for a while. And what's the rules? One manufacturer, they claim that if you take the hard hat and you can flex it without it cracking, it's still good service life. So your organization needs to have a process in place. Again, it doesn't have to necessarily be written, but that's going to be more for the 45,001. How do you identify service life? And then that's going to come back for environmental. When you do start throwing them out, where are you putting it? Are you recycling it? What are you going to do with this? So there's a lot of different things. Another one I have fun with are jack stands for tractor trailers. I was always told that there was a requirement the jack stand had to be within an inch or two of the bottom of the trailer. Well, it turns out the OSHA requirement says whatever the manufacturer recommends. So that makes it a real challenge now to go in, and we have to find out, okay, what are the jack stand brands that are being used at that company? And then go back and find out what the manufacturer says. It's supposed to be up tight, it's supposed to be within a couple inches. Where's it supposed to be? So looking at how your system is set up, what are the tools and equipment you're using, what is the manufacturer's recommendations, and what is your regulations in whatever part of the world you're in that require what's supposed to happen. Next slide, please. Okay, we've got another poll for you. What's your organization's approach to the integrated management system? What are you doing today?
So we've got 5 options for you here. Thanks, Rod. We already have an integrated management system. We already have an integrated management system and want to add more standards to it. Thirdly, we would like to integrate our systems in the next 12 months. We don't currently plan to integrate our management systems, or we are not currently certified to either ISO 9001 or 14001. So just to go running through those options again. For your current approach to integrated management systems. So we already have an integrated management system. We have an integrated management system and want to add more standards to it. We'd like to integrate our systems in the next 12 months. We don't currently plan to integrate our management systems, or we are not currently certified to either 9001 or ISO 14001.
All right, for over half the organization or the participants today, you already have an integrated system. Excellent. Now the challenge is how well are they working together? So I had one situation a number of years ago where it was a very large tire manufacturing plant, over 1,000 employees. It was very integrated as far as the way they ran their business, but the front offices weren't necessarily integrated. So I found that the quality department had a documented information system. The environmental had a different documented information system. The safety had one, and the information technology, the IT people had one. I got my hands on their documented procedures, and they all looked the same. Each group had a part-time document coordinator. I went in with the president and the 2 VPs. I said, what the heck are you guys doing? You know, pick one of these 4 people, make her the full-time document coordinator, and look at your 4 procedures that they're identical except for the department name. And 3 of them got it real quick. So they started moving in that direction. So even if you have an integrated system, excellent. Now, how do we lean it out and make it better? Now, for the rest of you, as you look at, what are the options? Why do you want to get registered to one of these standards? I've got one plant. I just got introduced to them literally this week, Monday. They are registered separately to the 9, the 14, and the 45. They're not integrated yet. So they're having separate audits from LRQA every year for each of the 3 standards. And I've already started asking them about integration. And they're going to get a copy of this webinar that they need to take a look at this, because it will definitely save them not only time internally, but the time that LRQA has to come in and audit them. Because I'm a fully integrated auditor for the 9, 14, 45, and a few other standards. So I can come in and look at clauses literally 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10 one time, and then just focus on that particular standard for the rest of it. So we can cut days literally off of an audit if you truly integrate it well. And then even at integration, within LRQA, as the auditor going in, I'm looking at how well the organization appears to be integrated, and I can give discounts from 0 to up to 20% of man days based on how well your process is integrated. So continue with that, keep going with that. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so in the next part of the presentation, we're going to talk about how 9 and 14,001 integrate with each other. As we spoke before, Annex SL provides a high-level structure for modern ISO standards. Within that standard, there's 10 clause structure that shares more or less identical core text, terms and conditions, and definitions in most cases. This really enables management systems to be strongly harmonized. Discipline-focused details within the standards tend to be contained within Section 6 around planning and Section 8 around operations. So therefore, that's where we tend to see some deviation from the standards, from in management systems, from having fully integrated procedures. But yeah, the framework really helps us achieve that. Having those integrated management systems linked to Annex SL makes it much easier for us to link our strategic objectives to our operations. The standards define that. And once we are integrated, then it saves time, effort, and activity needed to implement our additional standards. So Annex SL provides us with that key top line level. Yes, pass over to Rod. He'll talk about some of the similarities and differences.
Next slide, please. So the similarities between all these different standards, again, all these management system standards, note the similarities in clauses again, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10. If we look at just the word shall, which is the mandatory requirements, this is what this slide is presenting. How many shalls are there in each of the clauses? Clause 8 is where the variety comes in. Now, one caution here. It goes all the way back to 1988, but in 88, 94, 2000, whenever there was a shall, every now and then there would be an AB or ABC under it. However, today, with the 2015s for the 9 and 14, there's a lot more of those sub-items, or I call them shall statements now. So you start adding up the shalls with the shall statements. So when the internal auditors are looking at, say, the 9,000, there just aren't 131 shalls anymore. There's 365 shall statements. In the 14, instead of just 80 shalls, there's 183. So the internal auditors need to make sure that they're looking at those very carefully, because the idea is the internal audit program should be so robust that it makes the external auditor's job very difficult to find anything. And I can usually tell within the first day, going through the documentation process, what the end result's going to probably be. And there are times I have 0 findings, and there are times I've had 9 to 15 findings because of the way they've either not integrated the process or they haven't looked at all their factors. Again, looking at the risk to your system. And some managements do it very well, some don't do it as well. So it becomes pretty obvious to the auditors when we come in to start looking at your system. Next slide, please. So streamlining your documentation, I already mentioned the tire manufacturer. They started looking at that. They realized, yes, these 4 documented procedures are identical. So they started looking at how do we kind of put that all together. Interdepartment cooperation. How do we start looking at making sure the system is working smoother? So one of the simple things during integration, and even for those companies that are integrated today from that last poll, do you have your internal auditors integrated? I find even with integrated companies, they have one team do the quality, one team do the safety and or safety environmental. And why not train them all up to do all of it? So again, trying to get their eyes open as they're walking around to look at anything. So there's any number of things. Here in the States, we have a 10-hour general OSHA course that's good to get people trained up on that. There are courses for environmental specialists. For the quality side, there is a whole series for Certified Quality Improvement Associate. There's all kinds of different things that you could utilize to advance the training of people in your organization. I also suggest on internal audits for the auditors to do some kind of quarterly lunch and learn process where you bring all your internal auditors together at one time, show them some videos, and there's any number of them like the one we're going through today, to let them talk about some of these different things. So you can combine the team that way to make it a full QEHS, or however you, I see CQ, I see all kinds of acronyms used here. But how do you get everybody looking at across the boards for whatever standards you want to be registered? And even if you aren't registered, so I've got a number of clients that they're 9 and 14 right now, and I'm after them to incorporate the safety as well, because they have to meet, we have a number of regulations that here in the States from OSHA. Canada's got theirs, Mexico got theirs. So why not have your team totally integrated for your overall management system? The management team should have one management system. That's what these standards are about. So trying to get that as we look across this. All right, next slide, please.
Okay, so Rod's just made quite a compelling argument for having an integrated management system, but let's just break that down a little bit further and talk about some of the risks and advantages of an IMS. So an integrated management system takes the requirements of each of the management systems to ensure a standardized approach is taken against the common requirements, and that systems and processes are rationalized and right-sized for the needs of that organization. Common approaches can drive efficiency through that standard approach against common requirements, especially in topics such as training, where it becomes easier makes learning easier. If there's one set of processes, the administrative burden becomes less to keep the records, and it creates a wider understanding of how processes and operations work within an organization, if not just limited to a specific topic such as environment or quality or even information security. This efficiency can also extend to auditing, both internal and external. Having an integrated management system can significantly reduce the amount of effort that has to go into internal audits, reducing the burden on not just the people conducting the audits, but those being subject to the audit, meaning there's less disruption to the business and reduced cost. It also makes the audit more focused with clear objectives and less duplication. If the requirements for all standards are met with a single set of processes, procedures, and policies, that removes the need for multiple systems, removes duplication, creating things more leaner and centralized, reduces the chance of conflict as well. For quality management, we need to do one set of activities, which may then be against the criteria that needs to be put in place for environment. By having one common set of goals, the two can work in harmony together. I think we also need to be really, really clear about what some of the risks are. So with integrated management systems, unless organizations are very careful, then one standard or topic can dominate over the others. Quite often we see it with safety in high risk environments, taking more resources and time away from the other standards to the detriment of those. What we need to make sure is that we have a real balanced approach in place. Organizations must be conscious of that potential risk and ensure that effort and resources are effectively balanced to meet the priorities of the business and the importance of that standard to its operations. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we've kind of come to the end of our formal presentation. If you've enjoyed the presentation and you'd like more information, then we've got plenty of guidelines and customer information notes around this topic on our website. So that's at LRQA.com. We've also got a range of training courses which cover this topic in a much greater level of detail. And they go all the way from kind of introductions to CQI and LRQA certified lead auditor courses in a variety of different formats, so on-site and remote. And also, obviously, we've got our gap analysis and certification services where we can discuss these topics in greater depth. Okay, so that's the next steps following the presentation. We've got a couple of poll questions to come before we go into a Q&A session. So if we talk about our first poll question, and that's, will your organisation be looking for any services in relation to 9001 and 14001 in the next 12 months?
Thanks, James. So with this poll question, please select all that apply. So in relation to ISO 9001 or ISO 14001, will you be looking for management systems training, gap analysis or certification in the next 12 months?
As everybody is going through this one, keep in mind that when you engage us to come in to do an audit for the certification, we're not allowed to consult with you. But a gap analysis is the one exception that a registrar like LRQA is allowed to give you specifics of how to make it valuable in your system. So if you are adding a standard to your system, a gap analysis can be very beneficial because you can tap into the expertise of that auditor on what has happened, what they've seen out there, because most of our full-time auditors, and we're doing audits virtually every single day of the year. So we see an awful lot out there.
Okay, so great to see that split. Thank you. And our final poll question for today is, will your organisation be looking for any other assurance or training services in the next 12 months? So thinking about your integrated systems, if you're looking to incorporate anything else. So select all that apply, please. We have ISO 45001, the Occupational Health and Safety Standard, ISO 27001 for information security, ISO 50001 for energy management, ISO 14064 for greenhouse gas emissions verification, and data and information verification. So I do apologise. I see that we've got 27 there twice. The
second one was intended to be 50,000.
It should have been 50,001. I'm sorry, which is the energy management system standard. The results are still coming in. Thank you to everybody who's taken part in those polls today. So we can see that half of the people that have responded are looking to incorporate 45001 occupational health and safety. So thank you very much for taking part in the polls, and it's now our turn to answer your questions. So as a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in the attendee control panel. And James, we'll come to you with the first question. So in the presentation, we looked at similarities within integrated management systems, but are there any differences that you need to maintain or elements that you need to keep separate when building an integrated management system?
Okay, so within the presentation, we spoke a lot about the core elements within Annex SL and how they help us identify which procedures we can integrate together and achieve our benefits. And there's a lot of systems and a lot of processes where we can make sure that quite a lot of it is in a combined integrated manner. However, we need to be aware of the specific requirements and examples of within our own context of our organizations, to where we may need to deviate that and have specific operational controls or specific processes and procedures in place. For example, very basically, within ISO 14001, there's a requirement to identify your environmental aspects and impacts. Within the quality management system, ISO 9001, there's no requirement. So it would stand to reason from that basis, you would have a separate process in place for delivering that outcome. Similarly, if we go into kind of product realization, we'll have lots of different processes in place within organizations for testing the effectiveness or realization of their product and making sure it's met the intended outcomes. So which wouldn't necessarily be required within a 14001 management system, but then we may have specific requirements within that management system to meet environmental needs, such as how we manage waste or monitor our emissions from site. So we need to be aware of where management system procedures can be carried out in an integrated manner and where they need to be kept separate to achieve the best results. Hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you, James. So Rod, our next question is for you. Do you have any tips for internal auditors for identifying risks?
One of the things that I will commonly mention to people is that as you're, especially with new auditors who may not be familiar with process approach, is there is an organization out there who has figured out how to take a order from a customer, process that order, and actually give it to the customer sometimes in less than 5 minutes. And when I have fun with that, I say, okay, who am I talking about? By the way, it's anywhere in the world, literally. They're all over the place, and they know how to do it even with high school kids consistently. And it's a fun little exercise there because it's McDonald's. Many towns have a McDonald's in it. And if you send your new people to the McDonald's, to your local McDonald's, and have them sit somewhere where they can observe what's happening behind the front counter and have them do some type of graphical study. I don't care if it's a flow chart, a spaghetti diagram, whatever, an IPO, do something. And then from there, they can start looking at, okay, what can go wrong here? Besides that, there's any number of courses you could take on what is risk involved. And again, getting the internal auditors to ask everybody they talk with, what could go wrong in your job, and try to gather any information they can, put it in the internal audit report, and report it up to management. So getting the internal auditors to observe what's going on and to ask the simple questions, and simply, what could go wrong or what has gone wrong in your job.
Thanks, Rod. So the next question we've had is if you can identify where in clause 9.3 risk management is supposed to be documented.
I just got to get over to it. Okay. Look under 9.3.3, management review outputs, the last statement. The organization shall retain documented information as evidence of the results of management reviews. So 9.2 or 932, 933, the very last statement in there talks about what, you got to have documented information. And that's where I'm going to pick on the fact, how have you identified your risk? Now, again, you don't have to have a risk registry, but you got to have something, be it through the internal audit program, be it in your management review slides. You need something documented on how you're managing your risks.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Rod. And I think that links in really nicely to a question that's come in from Eleanor Kershaw, actually. Where do you think an overly complex risk and opportunities register, which is time consuming and poorly used, is worse than having no formal process? Eleanor, absolutely, I agree with you. And the standard does as well. So yeah, just building from Rod's last answer, that there's no requirement to have a risk register within ISO 9001 or ISO 14001. But what it does ask us to do is determine what the risks and opportunities are and take action to address those. And then it talks about in 6.1, maintaining documented information on the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed, and the processes needed and the extent necessary to have confidence that they're carried out as planned. So that's what the standard asks for. So yeah, risk registers, you don't even need one. Overly complex, then that depends on the scale of the organization. So really what we're looking to see is that risk identification processes match the complexity of the organization. So large complex organizations are going to need more complex risk and opportunities processes, risks and opportunities registers than smaller, more simple ones. So hopefully that's answered that question.
Great, thanks, James. So the next question we've had from Heather is if you're looking to introduce different standards and they're thinking of ISO 9001, 14001, 45001 and 45003, is it better to do that all at one time or one at a time? And if you are doing one at a time, where would you start?
Okay, so I guess I'd probably quite like to answer that one as well, Heather, because again, that's another great question. So it really depends on where you are as an organisation and how developed your processes and procedures, controls you have in place for an organisation already. There's nothing to stop you going to do 9,001, 14,001, 45,001 all at one time. Some organisations, depending on the availability and resources and the time they have available, may then tend to bite them off one chunk at a time. Whatever happens, I think organisations can support you, certification bodies can support you through that process, but your decisions really need to be based on your business priorities and any kind of contractual or key benefits you're looking to get from certification at that time as to which management system you tackle first, or if you do them all together.
I'll add to that just to remind everybody, we're talking about your organization. You should have one management system. So your management review probably already has little tidbits of all these other standards that you're talking about. So what you need to add is train your internal auditors to start doing those different standards that you want to add. Because when I come in to do your stage 1, stage 2, I'm going to be looking at your management review and your internal audits. Have you been doing that for at least a year in the area that you want to add the standard to? So if you start working those internally, which ones make the best fit for you, and then you can talk with the LRQA, and we could then advise you which ones might be the best ones to start with. Where do you want to go? But do it internally with your internal audit and your management review. Those are your starting points. So yes, you can take them all on and then just add the registration. So in the meantime, you can say you're compliant to a standard without being registered to it.
Thanks, Rod. We have just a couple of minutes left and we've got quite a few questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. So we have next.
So there's a good.
Oh, sorry, James.
So
go.
yeah, there's a question coming from TS, TJAS, I think. So we have a common quality manual for approach for an IMS, or is it better to document them each separately? If you're looking to develop an integrated management system, then within the standard there's no need to have a manual. But if you choose to have a manual, then it makes sense to have it in one streamlined approach. So you've got one management system, one single source of truth for your employees and stakeholders to engage with.
And I'll add to that, go out and do an internet search for something called a one-page quality manual. Your quality manual doesn't need to be 30, 40 pages. It can be 4 or 5 pages to cover multiple standards. So there are techniques out there to keep it simple, but to cover the standards that you want to address.
Thank you both. So we have another question around, does ISO 9001 require organizations to address risks related to the context of the organization using the same methodology, or do you use different methodologies for different kinds of risk?
Okay, so again, I'd probably like to answer that one. And again, it's the solution that fits best, Maria. So yeah, different risks often require different tools to effectively analyze and manage them. So as long as you've defined within your management system the suites of tools you're going to use and everyone's aware of the processes you're going to use to manage that risk, and you can then demonstrate that's being applied effectively, then it's up to you how you do it. It doesn't have to be one process.
I think we've got time for just one last question before we wrap up. And so we've got one around about how you can use it to identify opportunities. So I guess looking at the more positive side rather than the kind of negative interpretation of risk. Do you have any examples you can share of how clients of yours have approached that or have used that?
So again, as the internal auditors are being trained to keep their eyes open and look at what's happening and ask the question, is this the best way to do this job? So one plant manager I was working with, we were looking at one of his lines. They were making rubber components, and they were pulling off a strip of rubber onto a wheel that they would then send to their customer. And initially when I saw it, there was a mechanism where the wind up, there was actually two sides to it, but they weren't using both sides. They were only using the one. And I said, why not? Well, it couldn't be rotated. Well, I said, well, just cut the pipe down here, put it in their core, and then you can rotate it so that it makes it simpler, because what they were doing was shutting the system down every time they had to swap the wheel out. I said, you're losing valuable time there. So it was just something. And then when they got their maintenance person over, we started looking at it, and they said, yeah, we can do this. And it was a small win, but it saved them time when they were making that product, that they could keep the machine running full time, and it would just rotate it because they had a second person that was doing the packaging. So what systems can you look at? A lot of times when I see gauges, I see what is the proper use of a gauge? And a lot of times they'll be hanging up somewhere where they shouldn't be, or the person, I'll observe how they're handling a micrometer or a caliper, and it's not as good as what it should be for someone truly trained in doing that. So there are any number of ways that how can we make slight improvements. Now, you could utilize Six Sigma, you could utilize the 8D problem-solving technology, Kepner-Trago. There's any number of problem-solving concepts, but how do we prevent reoccurrence? That'd be another way to say some of this. So yeah, there are techniques out there. It's just how well are you trained your internal auditors to start asking those kind of questions and get people engaged. Could we do this differently? Could it be better?
Yeah, you can see the real value there of having that fresh eyes approach to systems. So thank you for that, Rod. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. So thank you to James and Rod, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave the webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we'd appreciate it if you could complete that and provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within the next couple of days with a link to view the recording of our webinar. So on behalf of LRQA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.